Hello, friends. Welcome to This Day in Jack Benny. I'm John Henderson. This is not a regular episode of the Jack Benny program. This is a bonus episode. In fact, there's no Jack Benny in this episode. But this is sort of a maybe kind of behind the scenes, state of the podcast type podcast. And with me is my actual wife, Stephanie Henderson.
Hello. How are you?
Oh, I'm great.
You know, I can't believe you're still doing this podcast.
You didn't think it would last this long?
Well, no, I know you, and I know that you when you do something, you do it all the way from start to finish. And wasn't Jack Benny on the radio for a really long time?
Yes. And, originally, I think I started in 2016, and I thought my goal is to finish an introduction for every Jack Benny episode by the time I turn 39.
Right.
I thought that would be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, I don't think I'm going to make it.
Yeah, but he turns 39 every year for the foreseeable future. Yeah. So I think you'll be okay.
Yeah, whenever it happens, it'll be my 39th birthday.
I'm taking over the podcast today.
Because
I would like to interview you on this special episode. A little bit maybe about your background with old time radio.
Yes.
How you got interested in Jack Benny. And what you've learned over the course of doing this podcast.
Yeah, we did this once before, and I had a lot of fun. So let's do it again. So what's the first question?
My first question is, how old were you when you first heard old time radio?
I think I was in middle school. And my brother heard about it from a teacher. He set our cassette stereo to record it off the radio because it was past our bedtime.
Oh, I see. So it was a late night thing.
Yeah.
And so you listened to it the next day?
Yep. And then I started listening to it regularly. And I don't think I've stopped listening to old radio shows much.
Out of all of the ones that you've heard, what's your favorite genre of old time radio?
Well, I go through phases. So what's my favorite now, or what was it when I first started? Because when I first started listening, I really liked science fiction because I was already into Star Trek and the Twilight Zone. And so I liked the X-1 and Dimension X. And another favorite of mine was The Whistler, which is one of those suspense radio shows, except it had a twist at the end.
Right. I think, I'm not as familiar as you are with this, but I do remember early in our relationship, we listened to an episode of The Whistler, and I fell asleep before the ending, and I could never tell you what the title of the episode was, but I really wanted to know what happened.
Yeah.
And of course, I feel like sleep is the brain's natural eraser, so can I remember what it was? No, but I'll give you that. The Whistler is very interesting.
Yeah.
One of my other questions for you about old-time radio was about Jack Benny.
Yeah.
When did you know that he was your favorite?
Well, maybe a couple of years into doing the podcast.
Oh, really?
No, I always liked Jack Benny, but I wouldn't say that originally comedies were my favorite genre. I started by liking the mysteries and the science fiction and the detective shows. But Jack Benny is the kind of show where the more you listen to it, the better it is, the funnier it is, because you get to know the characters. And a lot of the jokes are just these characters, right?
Yeah.
And it's the delivery and I feel like you start to appreciate it more over time.
I remember listening to Jack Benny with you years ago, and I would be like, what? What does that even mean? There'll be this reference to something in the 40s, and I'm I don't know what this is. So I would always ask you, why is that so funny?
Yeah.
And then you started looking up, oh, here's the context of that joke, here's why this was funny. And I feel like I actually was the inspiration for This Day in Jack Benny.
I definitely think that is the case. And even now, what is it, 4 years that I've been doing the podcast? Only now do I start to know the references as I hear them. They could do a reference 3 or 4 or 5 times, and every time I'll have to look it up because I don't know who that is, right? But only now am I starting to actually know the references as I hear them.
Right.
So that's actually fun to be able to hear the references and know them. Yeah, and that actually makes the research a little bit easier because you're not starting from scratch.
I know that there are aspects of the show that have not aged well, but there are other aspects of the show that are still quite funny.
Oh, definitely.
What do you do when you come upon something that you feel it did not age well?
Well, it also depends on what sort of thing it was and who the audience is. Like if I'm listening with my kids, it might be different than if I'm listening with an adult or if I'm doing an intro for the podcast, right? Like usually I just say for the podcast, I just say these days we wouldn't do that, right? But it is tough sometimes because some of them are like so offensive to modern ears that you're like, maybe I should just cut that out. But I haven't really done that much. Maybe with one episode I did, and I mentioned at the beginning. But other ones are so obscure or so subtle that you wouldn't even know that that's a racist thing unless you were to research it. And then it's like, especially with the kids, it's like, should I mention, oh, guess what? That thing that you didn't even notice, that's a racist thing or whatever.
Right. Yeah, it's tough. For sure. And I know that there are just some things that I don't think we would understand because we didn't live in those days. And even more so for our kids, they just have no point of reference at all.
Well, I just think about some of the things that even when I was growing up were considered fine and these days are considered politically incorrect, right? And when I was a kid, I didn't think of them the way that I think of them now, right? Like I didn't think, oh, this is a misogynist thing or something like that. And so, yeah, I mean, society changes and we learn and grow. I thought it was really interesting to talk with Elva Green. I don't know if you ever heard that interview that I did. Yeah. And she was the daughter of Eddie Green, who was a black actor in the 30s and 40s. And her perspective and her stories about her dad are very interesting. So, go back in the archives and listen to that one.
Right. And she actually had met Rochester, if I remember
that's
correctly.
Right, yeah.
He would visit their house.
Yeah.
He's my favorite. He just always had such a great timing. And
I was surprised to hear that even off stage, everybody called him Rochester.
Oh.
Because his real name is Eddie Anderson, right? But she said that everybody just called him Rochester.
Very interesting. Now, I know that you still have quite a few shows to go in terms of finishing out all of the episodes that ever aired on the radio. Do you think you will finish?
Yeah, I think so. I tried to do the math and guess how long it would take. Maybe I need to do the math again. I think I'm like a third of the way done only.
Right. So this is like you're in it for the long haul here. Boy, when you started this project, you made it sound like it was like, no big deal. You could get this done really quick.
Well, I thought I could do like 2 or 3 episodes a week. Easy, right?
We have 4 kids.
Well, we didn't have 4 kids then, I don't think. But I've realized I'm only able to do 1 episode a week. But Jack Benny did 1 episode a week, and he was doing it for 30 years. So I don't think I'm going to be doing it for 30 years.
This is our foreseeable future here, for sure. Thinking about the Jack Benny show, I was actually just before we started recording this, I was asking you what were some of the most famous moments.
Yes.
Right? Like, Your Money or Your Life. What are the ones that come to mind for you that just give you that this is quintessential Jack Benny program?
I know that I don't have the best memory in the world, which has some...
Oh, really?
Yeah, you know that. I don't know if the listeners know that. But, I often forget things to the point where I can watch a movie a second time, and it's like I'm watching it for the first time. All the twists and turns are there.
Surprise.
The episodes that stick most in my mind are episodes that have connections, emotional connections in real life, right? So, for example, the first episode that I listened with you that got a big laugh from you is an episode that I remember. And that is the one where, you know how Dennis Day does impressions sometimes? So Dennis Day does an impression of Ronald Coleman, who's supposed to be Jack Benny's neighbor, right? And then he pranks Jack Benny, pretending to be Ronald Colman, inviting him to a party at his house. And then he shows up with his girlfriend, and he thinks it's a costume party, and they don't expect him to be coming at all, and hilarity ensues. And that got a big laugh from you, and so I think I'll always remember that.
Definitely. That was a funny episode. I think that's one of the reasons why I actually have enjoyed you doing this podcast, because you're making it accessible for people like me, who I did not start listening to old time radio in middle school or whatever.
Yeah.
My first real exposure was, being with you.
Yeah.
And
that reminds me, we were listening with the kids to an old radio show today, and one of our daughters, when it started playing, she said something like, the sound quality could be better on this one. Because I think I had said that last week. I was like, the sound quality could be better on this one. And so this week she's like, the sound quality could be better on this one. But,
and your heart swelled because you just love those things they're going to take after you when this is all done. But you really are opening it up to those of us who maybe are very new to old time radio, and capturing some of those things that I think otherwise would be lost to history. I mean, who is looking up the Papermate pen thing? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
What
Papermate pen is leak proof. In the 50s, they were always talking about these Papermate pens, so I think they must have had like commercials all the time, right? There was a jingle that was like, Papermate pens are leak proof, right? But then the other thing about them is they could write underwater.
Right. I also love how you've archived everything on your website. thisdaybenny.com is a good place, because if you're looking for something, if you're looking for an episode, you can just go through it and it's all right there.
Yeah, I mean, I initially did that for my own benefit, because I was like scrolling down to find specific episodes, pages and pages down. And so I've set it up so you can click on the decade, and then you can click on the year, and then you can see all the episodes in that year, whether I've done them on the podcast or not. And the ones that are on the podcast are highlighted in blue, so you can click on the link and listen. But they also, this is what has been fun, finding like a thumbnail that goes with it. Right. So whether it's a picture of an ad from that time, or if it's an episode where they did a spoof of a movie, I'll find the poster for that movie or a still from the movie. So yeah, check it out. thisdaybenny.com. That's fun.
I do love that. I think that you've done a great job. But I'm married to you, so, this summer, what's happening with the podcast? I know that some people go on hiatus. I know others do other things. So what's your plan for this day in Jack Benny for the summertime?
Yeah, well, this is a way that I can catch up with Jack Benny, so I won't be doing the podcast for 30 years, because he would always take hiatus from about this time until October, right? So that's several weeks where I'll be doing a show and he was on hiatus, right? So in the past, I've done some things like interviews with people. So if you want to check out those, or maybe we can talk about some of those later.
But you interviewed his grandson.
Yeah.
That's right.
And many, many more people, important people, like my grandma.
Right.
Who was alive at the time and stuff like that. But this year, I'm going to be doing a sort of theme, which is the Buck Benny episodes. So for a series in the late 30s, early 40s, he did a character of Buck Benny who was like a cowboy. So instead of doing a spoof of a movie, he would do like a sketch where he's this cowboy Buck Benny. And that's how Andy Devine came on the show, the squeaky voice guy, because he was always in those Western movies. So he sort of joined the show to be the sidekick to Jack Benny as Buck Benny the cowboy. And so this year I'm going to go through pretty much all of the Buck Benny episodes, and I've never heard them before. Like, I've heard one or two here and there, but I've never heard the whole series. So I think it'll be a fun summer thing to go through all the Buck Benny episodes.
I know a lot of people are wearing masks these days in public and places like that. So, you actually have merchandise that you sell.
Oh, yeah.
There's a link on the website, thisdaybenny.com. I noticed that you've got Jack Benny masks.
Yeah, if you're listening from the future, this is the COVID-19 pandemic, in case people forget. But yeah, so I've got the store that they now offer masks. So I've got one mask that's just like I think it says one of Jack Benny's catchphrases. I can't remember. But the one that I'm really the most proud of is it's Jack Benny's face, but like the bottom half of his face. So you put your mask on, it's like you're pretty much Jack Benny. You put your hand to your cheek, you got it.
Done. Did it. That's your Halloween costume and your pandemic mask.
There you go.
All in one. Now, I know that This Day in Jack Benny is not your only old-time radio podcast.
Right.
There's a few other shows and genres that you've picked up and you've kind of expanded. So tell me just briefly about those few podcasts that you have.
Okay. So after doing only Jack Benny for a while, I started to remember some of those old favorites that I used to listen to. Like I mentioned, The Whistler, right? And then there's Suspense and Inner Sanctum Mystery. I was talking with my grandma about how that's one of her favorite ones. And so I thought it would be fun to do a podcast of those spooky old-time radio shows. But I was driving in the car one time and listening to one of those, and I started imagining the ridiculous voices they have and what it would sound like if I did one. And so I started talking like this, and it's so silly. And I'm not too worried about, a lot of those don't have the references that they have in Jack Benny and stuff like that. So I don't have to worry about that. And I just have fun and do ridiculous puns like they used to do in those old radio shows. So that's fun. And every once in a while I have you come on, or I'll surprise you with a microphone in your face.
My favorite.
You're always annoyed to the delight of me, if not everyone else.
Theater of Thrills.
Yes. So the podcast is called Theater of Thrills. And if you go to the website, thisdaybenny.com, there's a link to it as well.
How about their Damon Runyon series?
Yeah, so that's the newest one. The Damon Runyon Theater was a show that I think I'd heard one episode over and over again. Just I happened to catch it on the radio or whatever. The episode that I had heard was The Lemon Drop Kid. And it was interesting. It was fine. And then I went down this rabbit hole of Damon Runyon, because I had never heard the name Damon Runyon. They say the Damon Runyon Theater, and I'm like, who? Never heard of him, right? But it turns out there are as many movies based on his stories as there are episodes of the old-time radio show.
Wow.
So I thought it would be neat to play a clip from a movie that was based on the story, and then play a clip of that story. Or if they don't match, then play a clip of a random movie and then a random story. So they've got Shirley Temple is in one, Little Miss Marker. And they did that story a bunch of times with other people like Bob Hope and Walter Matthau and so on. And I don't know, it's in some ways it's really hard to explain unless you hear it. There is a style to the writing and just all the characters. So it takes place in Broadway in the 30s or 40s with these characters who are either gamblers or horse players or even gangsters and murderers and stuff like that. But every episode has a nugget of emotion in it.
Right.
So first it's fun and silly and delightful, and then at the end it hits you right in the heart. Yeah, so that one I've called I could have just called it the Damon Runyon Theater, but again, I didn't know who that was. So people who are looking on podcasts probably don't know who that was. So I called it Famous Stories, the Damon Runyon Theater.
Nice.
So yeah, you can check that one out.
Great. And I know that one of the most interesting parts of old-time radio is hearing how life was for different age groups. Teenagers in particular. Things have changed, I think, for teenagers in 2020 as opposed to in 1940. But it's like a time capsule. It's like going back in time. So tell me about Gee Whiz.
Well, I remember when I was a kid listening to the Aldrich Family and hearing teenage life, and it was nothing at all like my own life. But I always like to transport myself to that world. It's sort of like Happy Days or something like that, right? Where it's just it's nostalgia, but it's not your nostalgia. Living somebody else's nostalgia is always interesting.
Yeah.
And so when I was thinking about doing Gee Whiz, I thought, how long would it take to do every episode of The Aldrich Family and play it. And apparently it's 1 year
Right.
if you do 2 episodes of The Aldrich Family. And then as a bonus, I got an episode of The Archies in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. The Adventures of Archie Andrews.
Right.
So it's sort of like, if you've got lots of time, you could listen to an episode of The Aldrich Family, an episode of Archie, and an episode of The Aldrich Family again every single week, right? Or you could listen to one a day. In our family, we've pretty much been listening with the kids in the car, and I'll look at the 3 episodes, and I'll pick my favorite, and I'll skip to that part, and I'll play that for them.
There's some Hardy Family in there, too, isn't there?
Yeah, there's more episodes of The Aldrich Family than there are episodes of Archie, and so I put the Hardy Family in between. And the Hardy Family is Mickey Rooney, and it's a film series. And you and I watched the film series together, and yeah, it's so much fun. It's sort of that similar thing, only, I don't know, Mickey Rooney is quite a character in himself. He's always got that Mickey Rooney attitude, and so, yeah.
That's a fun one for summer, actually.
Yeah.
Like if you're looking for something that's more of a lighthearted, kind of a break, just a different thing altogether. I really like Gee Whiz. Our kids really like that one too. Yeah. I know that the future is coming, and some of these series are ending. So Famous Stories is going to end this fall.
Yeah.
Do you have anything that you're working on to come?
Yes, I do. Now, when you say it's ending, it means I've done every episode, and I'm just going to start playing them again. So you'll still be able to listen to Famous Stories and Gee Whiz and all of that, but there won't be any brand new episodes.
Exactly.
I am working on something new, and I'm doing a lot of like research and like things like that, searching to find these obscure episodes in a particular theme. So it's going to be a surprise. I'm not going to say anything else about it yet, but I'm planning on launching that in January.
Okay, so be watching thisdaybenny.com for that.
Boy, what a great website, thisdaybenny.com.
So that pretty much wraps up this episode for This Day in Jack Benny. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share?
Well, I wanted to mention that we've got our Patreon, right? And so Patreon is a way to like pay for all of the expenses of doing a podcast or 3 or 4 or whatever, right? And so
doing a podcast network is really what you're doing. You just haven't called it that yet.
And so basically, you've got hosting, and you've got the time that I'm spending instead of like working or spending time with my family or whatever. And that kind of stuff. So you can donate, like, if you just want to, like, make a donation, you can donate $1 a month. But if you want to get some bonus episodes, at $3 a month, it's an extra episode per month. So that could be something like an episode, usually it's an episode where Jack Benny is a guest on a different program. But occasionally it'll be something, interesting, like an album. Like we've got some albums of Jack Benny's where he made a record. And so, I do some behind the scenes on the record and then play the record. And some other things from like the time period maybe I'll throw in there too. Or occasionally it'll be an episode where Phil Harris was a guest somewhere, or where it's an episode of the Phil Harris Show or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, so it's just extra Jack Benny related episodes. And at $5 a month, it's twice that. It's 2 of those episodes.
Great. And how do we find you on Patreon?
So you can go to patreon.com/thisdaybenny or thisdaybenny.com/Patreon. Or if you go to thisdaybenny.com, you can just click on Patreon. And so even this episode that you're listening to now is sort of a Patreon bonus episode. But I'm going to add as a sort of extra for the Patreon listeners, some clips of when I was a kid, when I started listening to old radio shows, my brother and I would make with our tape recorder, our own old radio shows.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah, so we've got like one version of Dragnet where we're just like joking about the fact that Dragnet was sponsored by a cigarette company. So it's Joe Friday, and he's like, oh, and I enjoyed my Fatima cigarettes or whatever.
Right.
And then I've got another one that we did as a Mother's Day present for my mother, where again it was that sort of detective thing, but we called him Philip Morris, Private Eye, because there was a real private eye called Philip Marlowe, and there was a real kind of cigarettes called Philip Morris that was advertised on another program.
Right.
It was just hilarious to us that like they would advertise these cigarettes because we never saw that when we were kids. And we were always told cigarettes are bad because it turns out they are. So just for fun, I'll throw that in at the end of the Patreon episode.
Great. Well, thanks for letting me take over your podcast today. I'm so honored. And I think you're doing a great job.
Well, thanks. And I could just go on and talk about this all day. So thanks for bearing with me.